was a dark and stormy night. A night haunted with visions of death. And when she woke up, she realized it had all only been a dream. The end. Welcome to my study. This is where I work, this is where I spin my terrifying tales, where I edit my videos, where I work on my chess game, where I do all of the things that I do. Today I am editing some of my short stories, and that's the topic of this video. I'm going to be reviewing a web-based software platform for writers that has great tools to help horror authors improve their fiction. The website is called AutoCrit, and it uses a variety of artificial intelligence functions to automatically critique your stories. I have a membership to the site. I'm going to log in and I'm going to show you how it works and give you a brief review of the website specifically geared toward horror authors, although what I'm going to have to say is going to apply to authors in general. I should also point out that I am a paid member of the website, and this is not a paid review, so you will be getting my real thoughts. However, I did sign up for their affiliate marketing program, so if you choose to buy their service through the link that I'll provide down in the What's It, I do get a small commission for that, so I'm being completely honest and upfront about it. That's not going to affect what I'm going to say, however. Alright, I've got a story here that I am ready to start editing. Let's dive in and see how it works. Okay, this is the AutoCrit website. You can get there using the link that I've left down in the What's It. I'm going to go ahead and get logged in. And if you remember, once you're logged in, you get to a page like this, from which you can upload a text or open an existing file through which you will be able to edit your stories or your novels. Up at the top, you can see that you're able to compare your text to a variety of different genres, including general fiction, which is the default. There are also options for nonfiction, academic, biographies, fantasy, magazines, newspapers, romance, science fiction, etc., etc. We are going to go ahead and pick horror because that's what we're interested in. And I'm going to insert a new story. They offer two different ways that you can input your stories. You can upload a file from a Word document, RTF, or plain text. I, however, have it already copied to the clipboard, so I'm just going to paste it in and submit. You can see my story here is now in their website. So there are a variety of options: summary, pacing, dialogue, word choice, grammar, etc. I'm going to start by just running the summary report, and it takes it a few seconds to a minute or so usually. And once it's done, you get a page that looks like this, giving the summary report. That number, 70.35, is an overall score. The way that works is that the higher the number is, the better your story matches the particular genre that you have chosen to compare to. 70 is reasonably good, but not really high enough, but that's okay because this is just a relatively early draft of a short story. You can then get some specific information. They've identified several indicators here, which are places that don't necessarily require correction, but that merit some attention during the editing process. Scrolling down further, you get more detailed things, including uncommon words, complex words. There's it gives you some reading levels, number of sentences, average words per sentence, a lot of data about your stories. And then it says, how do you compare with horror in terms of adverbs? Looks like I did reasonably well there. Generic descriptions, looks like maybe I could do a little bit better. Same with filler words, and I need to work on showing versus telling in this story. Power words are words that suggest a variety of emotions. from general, encouragement, anger, safety, energetic, fear, lust, greed, forbidden. In general, with horror stories, encouragement and fear as counterparts to each other tend to be the ones that you want to look for, so I've done fairly well on those. They give you data for consistency, sentence patterns, including cliches, initial pronouns, and then repeated words, uncommon words, repeated phrases. It gives you a word cloud of word frequency. My main character is Jim, so that makes sense. Same thing with phrase frequency. And then we can get more in depth with each individual category. So for pacing and momentum, if we're interested in sentence variation, we can run that particular report. So here we're looking at lengths of sentences. So I've got mostly short sentences and then some medium ones, not too many long sentences in this particular story. And then individual sentences, it gives us the length of sentences as the story moves on. These very short ones at the beginning are not actually sentences. Those are my name and address and sort of contact information. The actual story starts here with this 24-word sentence right at the beginning. We can then look at pacing. And these ones that show up in red are areas that it suggests could use some attention. In this case, it's suggesting that this paragraph is too long. When we click on them, it highlights them in red and takes us to the part of the story where those are. Similarly, we could look at, for instance, adverbs in dialogue. And we notice no problems found there, so we can skip over that one. We could look at word choice, and let's say we're interested in point of view consistency. And we have first person, second person, and third person indicators in different colors. And I have several of all of those, and that's because we have a third person narrative, but also characters speaking about themselves and to each other. So there are little bits of first and second person and lots of third person, which makes sense as it should be. One of the things we could look at under strong writing is adverbs, which is frequently a place that my first drafts struggle a little bit. And we notice it gives us the word, how many times it occurs, and then it recommends what to do. So for instance, I use the word probably 4 times, and it suggests that in comparison to the horror genre for a story of this length, I should be using that word about twice. Then when you click on it, it takes us directly to the word. And if we click again, it takes us to the next instance of that word. Here, probably not what you expected when you signed up for field research, is a quotation. I want the word probably there. But this one, for instance, it probably would be a better idea to wait for the medic. We can eliminate that word, and we can edit directly here in the interface. When we're done editing, we can save, and that saves it on the AutoCrit website. We can also export, and it will be able to save it as a Word document or whatever other type of document you want. One of the things that people have gotten used to are grammar checkers. So let's look at spelling and grammar. And we'll see if I have made any mistakes there. It seems to have found 9 spelling things, one of which is in my address, and we'll skip past that. There's also a character's name. We're going to skip past that. There's a scientific term. We're going to leave that, of course. Parasitology is a correctly spelled but unusual word, so we're just going to leave that. That is a foreign language, which I actually need to check with a translator to make sure I've got it correct, but the spell check is not going to help me there. And the rest seems to be the same thing. So let's look at the grammar issues. It seems to not like some of my blank spaces. And so far, I'm not seeing any mistakes that I actually want to correct. But we could go through the entire story and correct spelling and grammar as we want to. One of the things I will say is AutoCrit is not the best at spelling and grammar checkers, although it's good enough to get the job done. Where it really excels is in identifying things like overuse of adverbs, not enough sentence variation, potential pacing issues based just on length of sentences and lengths of paragraphs, and that sort of thing. This is not the sort of thing that I would ever consider a replacement for editing yourself, or in fact for having a professional editor look over your story. But where it helps is it helps the author identify certain blind spots. For instance, many authors begin far too many sentences with he or she or a character's name, and AutoCrit will quickly identify those issues and give you an easy way to go through and check all of those and change as many of them as you need to. And presumably, as you get some editing done, your score will go up. The way I have been using it is, in fact, just that way. I'm checking all of the various reports that it gives me, but I'm paying specific attention to the ones where I know my writing can sometimes be weaker in my early drafts. And then I can go through, change all of those, tighten it up, and then I can send it off to early readers who can help me with issues like plot continuity and generally make it a better story. But it's all well and good to say that the software works. How well does it work? Do these overall scores actually tell us anything? For instance, my story here has a score of 70.33 at the moment. So let's compare that to some other stories. This story is an early draft of mine, and I fancy myself a fairly decent writer, but of course it is an early draft, so it's going to be imperfect. Let's compare this to some published works, both good and bad, and see how well AutoCrit identifies good horror versus bad horror. Okay, so let's upload a new text. We can clear my open text because I don't actually need to save that story. We can choose a new file. In fact, the one that I have chosen is Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. So this is a classic story, widely regarded one of the best in the genre. Let's see what the summary report says about that. In that case, we get a score of 60.91, which is actually lower than mine. The reason for that is that The Telltale Heart was written long enough ago that its writing style is fairly different compared to the more modern text that AutoCrit is looking for. So that identifies a weakness in the software, particularly if you're writing something stylized or in a more archaic tone or language. In fact, if we scroll down, we notice that filler words in showing versus telling, it flags massively, but that was more the style at the time. It does give us very high scores of fear and encouragement in the so-called power words category, which is exactly what we'd expect from a horror story. Let's try something more recent. We can clear that one out. And I'm choosing a story now written by modern master of horror Robert McCammon. And we'll run our summary report. And in this case, we also get a score of 62.01, which is a bit lower than I would expect. Usually when I have tested works by more modern masters, I've gotten higher scores. We notice that it's generic descriptions, showing versus telling, and filler words that are flagging this particular story. And that's a good illustration of the limitations of the AutoCrit platform, because it's identifying areas that are potentially worth looking at. That does not mean that this story is not as good as my early draft. What it does mean is that my early draft more closely matches the aggregate average of all stories that they have put through their algorithm. As a matter of fact, one can argue that looking at a master's work like Poe or McCammon frequently can give us a lower score, specifically because those works stand out from the crowd in a way that something like my story, which is not bad but is not on that level, just doesn't stand out quite as much. So we've seen what it can do with good stories. Let's see how well it does with a really, really bad story. I'm going to upload a new file. Okay, I've uploaded this new file and I have deliberately not shown you the title or author because this is in fact the worst story that I've ever read, and it gets a score of 46.33. Areas of trouble. We notice there are not many adverbs or generic descriptions, and the reason there are not many generic descriptions is because the descriptions are absolutely out of control wild, which illustrates that maybe we don't want to just go by this computer's thing, but we also see too much showing versus telling, too many filler words. We can look at the grammar tab on a bad story. And if we run the spelling and grammar report, we see not many spelling mistakes, but many grammar mistakes. In terms of strong writing, we can look at unnecessary filler words, for instance. And there are, the word that shows up 61 times. It suggests to remove about 38 of them, just as an example. We've seen what I would consider a mediocre story, my early draft. We've seen some good stories that don't get great scores because they stand out from the crowd perhaps too much. We've also seen a very bad story get a very low score. In general, I have found that anything above 75 or so seems to be about what you'd expect of your average publishable story in the current market. I tend to try to aim for better than 80 in my work, just because I know that the kinds of things that it's identifying are frequently the kinds of things that I have a blind spot for in my own writing. Things like overuse of adverbs from time to time, occasionally drifting into telling versus showing, etc. One other handy feature, in addition to comparing to the horror genre as a whole, we can also compare to certain authors. For instance, Adam Neville, Anne Rice, Brian Keene, Dan Simmons, Isaac Asimov, J.K. Rowling, and so forth. I believe Stephen King is one of the options. Yes. So if you're interested in writing specifically in the style of Stephen King, instead of comparing to the entire horror genre, we could compare our story to Stephen King's work and rerun our report. This is actually not my story, but the bad one, and it doesn't change the score much in this case, but that's a useful thing for people who are particularly interested in writing in a style reminiscent of a certain author, or who are interested in avoiding styles indicative of certain authors. For instance, if you are very much in the style of Clive Barker, but not much in the style of Anne Rice, you might want to compare to Clive Barker rather than the entire horror genre that's going to include other authors as well. There is one additional feature that's worth looking at. Let me go back to my story so we can have a look at it. Okay, we are back to my story. There is also this text reader feature. What that allows us to do is select a portion of the text and allow the computer to read it to us aloud.
Smiling, Jim Aldman took in the sights of the Amazon as he led his group of students on their first tour of the rainforest. After nearly a decade of field research, Jim was familiar with the region.
That's enough for now. The idea there is that hearing a story read aloud can help identify awkward phrasing, various pacing issues, etc., that might not stand out just from visual words on the page. That's not a feature that I use, but it is a handy feature for those who want it. Well, and that does it for our quick overview and review of the AutoCrit platform. And that just leaves us with the question of whether or not I recommend this platform for horror authors. And the answer is yes, but with certain reservations. If you're looking for something that's going to edit your story for you, AutoCrit will not do that. However, if you're looking for another tool among many that you can use to improve your writing by small increments, then in that case, I think AutoCrit might be just what you're looking for, specifically because it does allow you to compare to either specific horror authors or the horror genre in general, and to use those comparisons to improve more stylistic things rather than just grammar problems. Of course, this is never going to be a replacement for proper editing, and in fact, they do not advertise as a replacement for proper editing. You will still need to heed the advice of the editor at your publishing house, or if you're self-publishing, you still need to hire an editor to look over your work professionally. However, using a tool like AutoCrit will help you present a slightly more polished draft to that editor, which could improve your chances of selling a work and certainly makes their job a little bit easier and the easier their job is, the better they can help you make your work. So with those reservations in mind, and bearing in mind that the platform did not perform perfectly in evaluating some of the master level works that I used to test it, I nevertheless do recommend the software as particularly useful for certain phases of the editing process. And as I mentioned before, I've left a link down in the What's It, so if you are interested in trying AutoCrit, you can just click that link and they will get you up and running in no time at all. I realize that this video is only of interest to a subset of my viewers. However, I'm also aware that many of my viewers are writers, so it just makes sense on occasion to discuss things of interest to that community. I will be back next time with more general interest programming. Until then, take care and stay scared.